Welcome to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's good to be with you today. A couple things up front. I do know someone reached out and let me know that the arrest Netanyahu protests are going on right now. And I just wanted to say, first and foremost, my solidarity with anybody putting their body on the line right now. And I did not mean for this live to be some kind of distraction or competition with that. So I know I mix what I like is Jared Ball is hosting. He's live there. So if people want to check that out on Black Liberation Media, I imagine Breakthrough News as well. So and then obviously if people are in the area, I encourage them to be supporting, right? And so I just wanted to say that up front. Obviously, people can watch this at another time. And I know that there's people all around the world who also aren't aren't able to participate in that directly, and so I'm happy to have a conversation with all of you today as well. um okay. um Good to see you, Jared, and yeah, anyway, again, my solidarity with people who are in the streets. I just wanted to say that because somebody did reach out, not Jared Ball, obviously, and just note that it was a conflict in the time, and that wasn't anyway. Um, so why do this now? So, yeah, I mean, I've been incredibly frustrated, I think, by like a lot of folks, kind of demoralized by status quo, breakthrough news covering the protests. That's great. By recent events, and I mainly wanted to, first of all, I wanted to have a discussion around elections and counterinsurgency, a deeper one for a while. And I'm not going to go too deep today, although I will take probably over an hour laying out some of what I want to say here. But for people who are expecting me to just say a bunch of stuff about Kamala Harris and how she's a surgeon and all of these things, I'll reference that. Obviously, that's a deeper conversation I think should happen with folks who have experienced her, as an as an attorney general in California, as a district attorney in San Francisco, as a senator, right, and so on. And so there's a whole record that we can dig into there in terms of her relationship to APAC, her carceral policies, all of those kinds of things. So that's a worthy endeavor, and we'll get to that. But I just want to give people notice up front that that's not what I'm going to be doing today primarily, um, because I think that it's important to set some parameters up front about the relationship between elections and counterinsurgency. Um, that there is an intricate, detailed, almost ancient relationship between these things, that it's not this is not me projecting something on and saying, hey, like, elections are counterinsurgency. Like, no, the counterinsurgents are very clear about that, right? They're very clear about that in their own literature. And so I think it's important also for us to be aware, again, of what imperialists say, what the ruling class says, right? We study colonialism, we go back, even though it's an ongoing thing, right? But we go back and we look at, what Cecil Rhodes was saying, right? Or Jan Smuts, or these various figures, right? And we read what they said about the things that they were doing. You study Zionism, right? You go back and you read Theodore Herzl and stuff like that. So I think it's important to actually look to some degree at what counterinsurgents say. And we'll get into a little bit about why we talk about counterinsurgency, why we don't use other terms, which I think is a worthy debate, right? Of whether we should even use that term, and more, right? So those are some of the things I'm going to do today. Hopefully get us into this. And I hope to have a lot more conversations. Like I said, this is part one. I want this to be a series. I initially actually reached out, you all probably can imagine, to Laura Shihai, to Dylan Rodriguez, because those are two folks I thought would be really good to have a discussion with. I was also initially going to have a conversation with Abdul Jawad today. None of them were able to do something today, right? So that's also part of the reason for the solo episode, and all of those conversations will happen. So there's a lot more that we can get to with other folks. Talk to Brooke Terpstra. Hopefully he's going to join for one, which I really would look forward to. So there's a lot of people that hopefully we can make this a series and kind of talk about different aspects of counterinsurgency and U.S. elections, and elections more broadly. All right. I think for me, one of the things to say up front too is like part of what has been demoralizing for me is obviously we founded Millennials Are Killing Capitalism to be an anti-imperialist podcast from the beginning, and we're in the middle of an imperialist genocide, right? And to see so many people willing to put other interests, concerns above that in this moment is really difficult. It's really hard to stomach. It's disgusting, I think. Um, and people can think that they're doing something else, but I don't think that they're doing something else. So that's one thing to say up front. Um, in using the word counterinsurgency, some people could say, well, there's not really an insurgency right now. So what's the need for counterinsurgency? I think one of the things to understand in the literature again is that um, counterinsurgency is essentially synonymous with political liberalism. It is essentially synonymous with a so-called advanced democracy that has elections, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Um, but it's a constant thing, right? It's not something that just happens when there's a threat to it. It's always operating in certain processes. Um, Having said that, I do think that there are movements that the ruling class is interested in co-opting or destroying, right? And one of them is the solidarity movement around Palestine. That's probably that is the most important one right now, right? Um, And beyond that, there's things like Stop Cop City, right, which has obviously been a big movement in Atlanta, but it's also something that, has the potential to become a national movement, I think, because there's so many, I think it's 68 different cop cities around the country. I know Renee Johnstone over on Black Liberation Media, has done that work. And actually, I would love to have a conversation with her about that sometime soon. Um, she's mapped out all these places, right, where this is happening. So that's another area where the ruling class does not want to see that insurgent movement develop into something broader, right? Um, we obviously see the level of repression that exists in both of those instances, right? People getting significant cases. Uh, yeah, I mean a lot, right? Some of the cases around student protesters I know have been dropped, but that's also I think just because they did so many that it was not really tenable, and a lot of people in both instances have been locked up for things that don't even make any kind of sense. So, um, yeah, you see the repression. That means there's also always attempts to co-opt. These things go hand in hand. Um, so this is just a personal anecdote, but years ago in my normie life, um, I was a part of a nonprofit organization, and there was an issue that we wanted to lobby around as an organization that would have allowed us to get more funding, right? This is in the kind of child services education arena. And we were in this meeting, and this guy says, they're talking about campaigning and all of this. And this guy said, yeah, we have to figure out how to market this thing. We have to figure out how to sell it, how to pull in different stakeholders and get people on our side and gain political legitimacy. He's like, I'm in marketing now, but in the military, I worked in counterinsurgency, and it's basically the same thing. Um, and so I think, In a country where politics and politicians are commodities that are basically sold to us, right? They're advertised to us literally on our TV shows, probably in between, um, things I'm going to say here today. They will run ads for, hopefully not Kamala. I think that I have done what's necessary to cancel political ads on this platform, but you know, who knows? They may sneak that in. Um, the other thing, and I was talking to Orasami Burton about this the other day. I've seen Adam Johnson of Citations Needed talk about this before too, but um, elections in the United States are constant and they're extremely long, right? Most countries, they might call for elections and have them within the course of like a month. And so this is this prolonged period of these ads, of campaigning, of all of this media attention that is focused on them, which then means less media attention on everything else, right? We've seen much less coverage around, I mean, it's not a good metric, but because the coverage around Palestine has never been good, but the media is spending way more time talking about Harris and Trump, right? And that means that there's less that it's garnering people's attention, right? They could be talking, thinking, struggling around other things, and they are, right? I don't want to take it away from that again, but even with the protests going on today, there will be some media attention, but I mean, part of that is because of Netanyahu and all of that. But you know, there there will be talking, of course, about this new presidential candidate, Kamala Harris. Um, in terms of the title of this discussion, I kind of went back and forth. You know, is it the highest stage? Is our elections the highest stage of counterinsurgency? Um, I thought about calling it the highest aspiration because it's clearly an aspiration. It's also, there's a lot of debate about whether elections are effective in counterinsurgency. And we'll come back to that a little bit, but a lot of that debate has shit, book just fell behind me. Um, but a lot of that debate has to do with um, the elections are not often successful within counterinsurgency because an imperial power is implementing the elections, if that makes sense, right? People know if you're in Iraq or Afghanistan or many other countries, right? And the United States is pushing these elections. Maybe they're also an occupying army at the same time that they're trying to bring these elections forward, right? This undermines the legitimacy of the process among the people, right? Um, they don't usually see it that way within counterinsurgency literature. They tend to put that off upon the imperialized people and their state as if there's something wrong there. But like, I think it's quite clear when you look at, um, you know, what's going on right now in the Middle East, right? West Asia, whatever people want to call it, that US is, seen as an imperial force by a lot of people, and a lot of people want that force out. They also want the Zionist entity out, right? For the same reason. These are seen as external malevolent actors, right? And so when those external malevolent actors are the ones that are controlling your process and telling you what to do, even if you can get ruling elites to go alongside that, the people typically see that more clearly as um well, they could see that and they typically don't like it or see it as super legitimate, right? So that's part of why within counterinsurgency literature there's different schools of thought about elections, but despite that there's a very strong thread if you look at what's called hearts and minds counterinsurgency. um, if you just read the counterinsurgency field manual that the United States government and military have, they're quite clear on these ideas of having having good governance, and part of what entails good governance are electoral processes, right? Um, Part of what they say constitutes good governance, I should say. All right. It's of course like quite I think telling that the people who uh say they want to win hearts and minds, right? This sort of liberal school of counterinsurgency, I'll call it. Um that They have the largest military in the world. They have the most military bases in foreign countries in the world. They have the highest incarceration rate in the world, and this massive militarized counterinsurgent police force that kills more people than almost anywhere in the world, right? And so it's, you know, that kind of gives lie to the whole game. And, Orasami Burton has said to me that I've talked to him a little bit about there's this debate within counterinsurgency, which I'm going to show a couple things from, I hope at some point in this conversation, but between these kind of liberal modes of co-optation, winning hearts and minds, convincing people that you are that that you're on their side and have their best interests, and that this is the way to dominate, right? This is one school of thought. This is the hearts and minds school of thought, we'll call it. Then on the other side of it, there's a school of thought that's basically just like, no, actually, you kill the insurgents, you kill portions of the civilian population, and you co-opt certain elites to your side, right? And I think that what Orasami, and I would love to have more of a conversation with him about this. What he's getting at is that these two things work hand in hand, right? These two processes are always ongoing together. So this debate between these two schools of thought within counterinsurgency literature, um, while they may think that they're debating with each other, they're really not. They just represent multiple strategies that are always at play at the same time, right? So anyways, I'm interested in hopefully exploring that with him at some point soon. Um, there's a lot of other elements that I do want to get into that I'm not going to get too deep into today, right? And so these are kind of future conversations I just want to let people know that we're going to try to have, but won't get deeply into today. So one is this relationship between counterinsurgency and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Perhaps we could talk about intersectionality and counterinsurgency. And obviously, that stuff's going to be people is going to be a little bit more spicy. Some people may not like that part of the conversation. Some of it's debated, and I think the interesting part is that the right attacks DEI a lot. We see this a lot, right? And so then it's weird when the left is then also critical of it. I see the right debate with DEI as the debate between hearts and minds counterinsurgency and fascistic counterinsurgency, right? So the right is just like, get all of this stuff away. We crush any dissent. The liberal counterinsurgency is about pulling people in order to co-opt them into your capitalism, your imperialism, your violence, right? And so again, these two things work hand in hand. But because of that, there is this debate, like, and you have the right wingers who are like, they hate everything DEI, and basically what they mean by that is that you just don't want black and brown people like in any position of authority. Um, Whereas on the left, my view or my critique around DEI has much more to do with the fact that these are liberal methods of counterinsurgency, right? So we can get to that another time. Um, I also want to talk about psychological warfare, elections, and counterinsurgency. I'd love to have some discussion on that with Jared Ball. I'd love to have some discussion on that with Lara Shihai. So yeah, anyways, look forward to discussing that. Um, but I certainly have felt like I'm under psychological warfare reading social media over especially the last week. But, we kinda always are. Um, there's some practical things I do wanna get to down the line that are sort of movement critiques of electoralism, right? Um, what happens on a local level when you win elections and you have what might be called a clientelistic relationship with local politicians? You uh, feel compelled to defend them rather than antagonize them. Um, maybe they give you your nonprofit grants or funding or, help connect you with funding. Um, you helped this person win, right? So now you feel uh, a psychic and effective relationship, right? That you want to see them do well. You want to defend them against critics, right? Um, so again, another discussion, but something I'm interested in talking about with folks. All of those I think are better suited for guests. Um, and the series, like I just hope that it's a space where we can get some clarity on some things. Um, I think this is going to be an especially brutal election cycle for a lot of us. I think it already is. And ultimately, for me, I do want to make sure that we keep bringing the discussion back to Palestine, back to what's going on. Yeah, we could talk about that maybe more later, but that's important, I think, on a lot of levels. Um, so Biden, and I'll talk about this more throughout the conversation to some degree, but I started getting concerned, not concerned because I didn't see it as a bad thing, but I I in conversations I think with Abdul Jawad Omar months ago, I got the feeling that Biden didn't have a chance to win this election. Um, and my instincts on these things are not always right at all. I'm not a very good predictor of many things. I didn't think Biden was going to win in 2020, so I was wrong about that. Um, but I thought that with the student intifada, with with what we were all seeing, that it would be very difficult for Biden to recruit younger people to be a part of his campaign. I thought that a lot of people would just not vote, right? A lot of people would vote third party. The third party numbers were much higher. I read something that said that, like, in many states, third party interest was like 10% of the electorate. Now, not to any one individual candidate. And again, like that, I know Daruba Ben Wahad has talked about a united front and why. And I think that his thinking around that, for if you're going to engage in electoral strategy, that does make some sense because we have all of these third party candidates and they all have some smaller percentage. But I don't want to get too deep into third party things because I know people have, critiques of that. And interestingly, even within the counterinsurgency literature, there's some weird stuff around third parties, and yeah. Anyway, that's another conversation. But regardless, I think Biden, that the uncommitted movement, I think that there were a lot of electoral issues that Biden had that come from Palestine, right? So when the debate performance happened, there was this immediate ruling class reaction across all media. I mean, I was watching CNN at the time, and I was surprised because look, he was terrible in the debate, but he's an old, like, bumbling genocidal freak. Like, I didn't expect him to debate well. I don't ever think that he's debated that well. There's always been weird things that he'll say, like, I think it was 2020 when he talked about, the need to play records, get the record player out and play it for black kids because they don't know enough words, like stuff like this. There's all kinds of things that Biden has done. He's had a horrible political career, I mean, mass incarceration, massive increases in policing. He's had to drop out of campaigns for plagiarism. Um, I know this is gonna get demonetized as I talk about these things. Um, the Anyway, all that to say, now he's in office and he's been committing genocide, right? So like there just was not. I I think that the media, and this is just my supposition, I have no way to prove this, but I think the speed of the immediate response had much less to do with how he performed. Like, I know a lot of people are like, "Oh, the debate was the thing that was the nail in the coffin for Biden." Um, and Yeah, I think it was. I think more a better way to think about it for me is I think it was the opportunity for the media to pounce and say, "Let's change course," and try to, and not just the media, of course, like the ruling elites, the people who fund campaigns, the donor class, the power brokers within the Democratic Party, right? It was all of those things, right? They were ready to pounce. Like, you don't get that ready that quickly to pounce. Like, I don't believe that. Like, I don't believe people just watch a bad debate, um, and they're like, "Oh, like, we need to immediately change presidential candidates." Like, that's not something that, like, there's no precedent for that in US history. All right, set that aside for now. Um, so then after that, you have the Trump assassination attempt. Very weird. I'm so tempted to go down weird rabbit holes of conspiracies, but I'm not gonna do that. Maybe another time just for fun, but I don't think conspiracy, as much as I enjoy a good conspiracy theory, and I really do, I don't view that as good politics, right? I don't view it as, first of all, it's not, we don't know anything really about what happened and why. Um, but you know, so I don't have anything insightful to say about it, so I'm not going to right now. I think that there's always much bigger political forces and political economy and context through which any so-called conspiracy happens that gets watered down and um, gets diminished by a lot of what we call conspiracy theories, right? We focus on an individual actor. Why did he do it? Who manipulated him? Da 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 da. Right? That's not. Anyway, so that happened. This was a large, again, like, these are things that are taking tons and tons of our interests, the attention economy. Like, I do think about that, right? About all of these things and like how much of our attention, how invested do we get in these different moments, right? Um, Biden then gets COVID and drops out of the race, right? And I think like everybody, like, great, right? One of the worst people in human history. Much worse should happen to him than dropping out of an election, right? Um, Genocide, Joe has got to go, has been a demand of the Palestinian solidarity movement since the beginning, and that's achieved, right? So I don't want to diminish that or diminish people's enjoyment of that. I'll just say that, like, well, couple more things. I mean, obviously, as I laid out the other things that he's done, you know, also say, like, people like Jalil Muntakim, folks from the New African Independence Movement, New African NAPO, right? They've long argued that what has happened to Black or New African people within the United States constitutes genocide, right? And Joe Biden is a key figure in that story as well, right? So all of that is even before, he's huge proponent of the Iraq War, right? Which was totally, I mean, I hate using terms like illegal or unlawful or whatever, but like there was no basis, right, for the Iraq War. It was just what the United States wanted to do. Um, segregationists, long track record of racist policy. Like none of that stopped him from being elected the first time, and that was because I think in large part this narrative, right, of having to defeat Trump, right, was successful on a lot of us, right, of us, So anyway, there's that. Um, there's a whole buildup of NATO that's happened under him. The resurgence and growth of NATO through this proxy war in Ukraine that you know could have been resolved through diplomacy long, long time ago. Um, all right. So he drops out. We all celebrate momentarily, you know. But my concern, honestly, was always, and this was my concern too, because there was a lot of people who were like, oh, maybe we can get an open convention, you know, and I understand that. I understand the idea that, perhaps a democratic quote unquote process would allow people who were in the uncommitted camp, people who had really wanted to push the issue on Palestine, give a forum through which people could try to leverage that issue for something. I think that belief is misguided and falls into a counterinsurgency trap, essentially. And I can answer questions about that later on. We could talk about that more later on, perhaps. But I always thought that the big problem with Biden also leaving was who's going to replace him. I mean, and this is the problem in general with the Democratic Party is seeing this as any kind of vehicle of change is the candidates that get the stage time, the airtime, the press, the ones that are put forward, they are the ones who are going to protect and defend ruling class interests. Kamala Harris would not be vice president of the United States already if the ruling class did not have full confidence in her delivering upon what they want, right? They want the genocide, right? They want the destruction in Palestine. And so I just think that it is misguided to believe that through their own games that we can leverage the political outcome that we want. I'll say that about that now, move forward. Um so like one thing about Biden versus Trump would have been that I think you would have had a greater number of people, a greater percentage of the population completely disaffected, not viewing the election as very legitimate, not viewing it as, I mean, you have these, like, you couldn't have a more perfect display of the sclerotic, decaying empire than Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Now, we could also look at that and say these are the two worst options that we could possibly have. But I think that the reality is that this gets into discourse around legitimacy, and that's a whole other topic that's going to take some time, I think, to unpack and dig into. And it's really important in political science. It's it's really important in counterinsurgency. It's really important within political liberalism. Um, there are, I think, critiques about it, and maybe it's not the right metric, but it's something that I think, I don't know, I'll come back to that, but part of it is like how invested are we in this system, right? And I think that when the system is losing legitimacy, that a greater number of people become disaffected. And yeah, actually, I'll show something here to this effect, also to just break up people staring, having to stare at me. Um, right, hang on. All right. So this is from a book that's behind me. It's called The Ungovernable Society. It's by a French author. His name, I may mispronounce this, is Gregor Chamayou. It's a genealogy of authoritarian liberalism. I credit Two Black actually with really introducing me to this book. He had us read a piece out of it for during the Journalism for Liberation and Combat sessions. Um, but it's a really good book, and it's about counterinsurgency, and it's about the ruling class, the capitalist elite in the 1970s, and the kind of crisis that the system was under. So, in this particular chapter, as the book is often told, it's told through the lens of the counterinsurgents, through the lens of the corporate elites, the people who are advocating for a new system. Hang on a second. Okay, good. Um, so anyway, sorry about that. So I'm just going to read this section quick. So this is a concern that the ruling class had in the 1970s. Um, there was this feeling that the part of the problem was that the government kept increasing the size of the welfare state. They kept handing out new programs. The way to gain political legitimacy and maintain it was to continue to try to co-opt people through government programs. People could think about the Lyndon Baines Johnson administration in this light, right? You could think about obviously FDR in this light too. But this dies in the 1970s, right? And so this is about sort of why it was killed. But one of their fears was like, on the one hand, you could have a process where, taxes kept having to go up. They had to tax the rich to increase the tax base. They had to continue to pay for these programs. It would become a point at which the state could be leveraged against capital, right, in order to bring more things for the working class and for disaffected people, right? They were really worried in this period about black liberationists, revolutionaries, about things like the American Indian movement, about also just a very militant working class, right? So the ruling class was really concerned in this period. Um, and they thought we're on a spiral. The state's going to get big. It's going to continue to go after capital. This is a problem for capitalism, right? So how do we manage this? So the basic theory then was like, well, what would happen if we just stopped trying to give people things, right? And so this is sort of part of one of the fears that could happen around this, right? So political parties, once elected, will inevitably disappoint expectations. As a result, the system as a whole will merely oscillate from one unpopular government to another. It was the theory of political alternation. The pendulum will swing between two main parties. It may be, Rose conjectured, that salvation will come precisely from these serial disillusions. The failure first of one party and then another will give the electorate as much as they want, to give the electorate as much as they want, may have an educative effect upon the electorate, leading them to expect little from the government because they have so often seen it fail. Parties alternating in power and repeating the experience of frustration will convert disenchanted voters into a healthy political realism. Yet, yes, except that it was also possible, objected James Douglas, that at each swing of the pendulum, the two-party system would lose some of its legitimacy. How far down could it go? How many alternate governments before we hit rock bottom? And what would happen at the end of this predictable slide? Some envisioned a growing disaffection resulting in mass abstention. Others believed that there was little chance things would stay there. As Klaus Oaf, I don't know if that's how it's pronounced, argued in 1979, the disappointment accumulated in this manner may realize their explosive force in one of two directions. With the rise with a rise to the extremes of the two sides of the political spectrum, or a polarization between the party system and social movements operating in a non-parliamentary fashion. One way to read that would be revolutionary action, right? Um, Options which can be combined and would in any case lead to huge political conflagrations. One such a cycle people felt could climax in a confrontation. Such a cycle could climax in a confrontation like the events of May 1968 in Paris, which did not overthrow a regime but indicated the limits of its authority, or like the successful French coup of a decade earlier. Anyway, ultimately, there would be two possibilities left: a situation of pre-insurgency and or Bonapartism. Because let's be reassured on this, the positive scenario would foresee individuals turning to government to protect them from disorder. That would be the path of strong government in the face of any peril. Anyway, it is true that the problem is structural, an inherent part of the internal dynamics of democracy itself. Then there can be no doubt, sorry, if it's true, right, that the problem is structural, there can be no doubt we cannot be satisfied with superficial countermeasures. We have to tackle one way or another what we have identified as the root of the evil. Right. So the root of the evil to them, to the right here in this viewpoint, um, is is the state, right? It is the type of state, right? It is the state that kind of that vacillates, right? And this is all kind of theory around how neoliberalism comes to be the dominant order, right? And again, I should say like the what that piece is Shamayu is just quoting extensively from what people are writing at the time from within the ruling class and their think tanks, right? So this is like public discourse basically among elites. All right. We could come back to that, or if people have questions about that, I can pull it up later. But I just wanted to show that to say, like, this is some of the concern, at least that counterinsurgents and the elites have about legitimacy within the political system. It's why they don't like it when the system starts to feel illegitimate. They think that this leads to insurgency. They're worried about this idea of parties working alongside organizations that use non-parliamentary tactics, right? So they're concerned about a May 1968 in France, which was this huge uprising, right? All of that. Um, so you know, Biden drops out. Harris quickly gets named officially by Biden within a couple hours, scoops up all of the necessary delegates within like 24 hours, a ton of, um, what should I say? Like, yeah, donations go through the roof, right? So, like, obviously, the ruling class is very excited about this development. You know, people thought, oh well, maybe we can go to an open convention. We can broker these developments. Maybe there'll be alternatives. None of the alternatives would have been good, but that quickly gets dispelled. Which again, I think we should say like this is evidence of the weakness of any current strategy that includes the left, whatever that means in the United States, operating as a kind of force or broker or whatever within the Democratic Party. I If you believed that before this past week, I think you should be completely dispelled of that notion by how quickly Kamala Harris scooped up all of the delegates in what could have been an open convention, right? We could if people have questions about that, I'm happy to talk about that more later too. Um, all right, and then the part that I think that has been so frustrating for people, right, obviously, is watching friends, relatives, maybe even people you've organized alongside or struggled with or whatever quickly get excited about this development, get excited about campaigning for Kamala Harris. Uh, yeah, I mean, just even if it's not your immediate circle, which thankfully for me, it's really not. Um, for all of us, it's people that we know that are at least one layer out from that, right? It's like, or you're seeing the people in your immediate circle kind of start to battle with these people online, and so you're seeing what people are saying. This psychic and affective of investment, right, in the process of selecting the next commander in chief of empire. That is counterinsurgency, right? So beyond what we could talk about in terms of Kamala as a counterinsurgent, which we'll get to in future conversations about the Democratic Party as counterinsurgents, right? Like the reifying, the reestablishing of people's interests, investment, emotional, psychic, and otherwise in this process, right? It's you can't square that with an anti-imperialism, right? You can't square it with stopping getting a cease, stopping the genocide in Gaza. You certainly can't square it with Palestinian liberation, right? These things are not, they don't go together, right? And so it's so difficult to watch, right? And you see people immediately kind of, well, I saw one thing, somebody just saying like, well, can we focus on America for once, right? I saw somebody else respond to that and say, yeah, if America would focus on itself as opposed to focus on, imperializing the globe, right? Being a global empire. Um, anyway, continuing on. All right, so some presuppositions. I realize I'm far into this conversation already, but why study it? Why use the term counterinsurgency? I said I would say a little bit about that. Um, I think study it for a simple premise, right? It's this, Sun Tzu said it in The Art of War long, long time ago. Know your enemy, right? Know your enemy, know yourself. In 100 battles, you'll never be defeated. I don't think that you'll never be defeated, but I do think it's important to know your enemy. Um, you can this studying counterinsurgency literature is not going to completely answer that problem of needing to know your enemy. It's just one thing, right? It's just one set of literature that's out there that's open to the public where they debate about how to rule, how to dominate, how to control people's minds, their hearts, what they believe, the processes that they use to do that, right? I don't think these are the only processes. I don't think they tell us everything, et cetera. But it is out there, right? It's a literature on what I consider the modern day playbook of colonialism. What we would think of as, the vestiges of colonialism that I'm not saying have ended, right? But this is where that literature lives on, right? Because they no longer in their own literature usually say, yeah, we're still doing colonialism and this is how we do it, right? They call it counterinsurgency now. So we can have that discussion. I think it's an interesting discussion of whether we should still be calling this colonialism, whether we should still say we're studying counter revolution, right? I think all of those are worthy, and I think those are kind of political questions for organizations. Um, but when I'm talking about it, I'm just using that word so it's clear that people talk can understand the body of literature that is out in public that I am reading and talking about, right? Um, the uh, the other thing too, just to name clearly, is that counterinsurgency and counterinsurgency, counter revolution, and colonialism are very clearly linked within their own literature. Um, Hearts and minds, which is one of the terms I've mentioned already. This comes initially from, well, supposedly John Adams used it way, way back, but French colonial administrators used it in 1895 in trying to suppress rebellions in what is now Vietnam, right? The counter-revolutionary war against the Malaysian communists is always cited as a key point of departure for a hearts and minds counterinsurgency. So again, like you just like what is it? It's communist it's counter-revolution against communist forces on one hand. It's the attempt to sup- it's a colonial administrative one school of thought around colonial administrative rule again of indigenous populations, right? So this is what it comes out of, right? And it self-references that. It's not like I'm saying it comes out of that. It's like you look on freaking Wikipedia, right? It says it. Um, Dylan Rodriguez traces a lot of modern counterinsurgency tactics in the US back to the Philippines, the US administration in the Philippines, the US war in the Philippines. Um, Counterinsurgency are tactics of counter-revolution. They are tactics of colonial and neo-colonial rule. Um, Part of why I don't use the term counter-revolution always in talking about this is it's partly a self-critique or a critique of where we're at, that I don't think we're actually at a point where we have something that we can point to and say, this is our revolutionary movement that is being counter-revolutionized against. So counterinsurgency, I think of as this ongoing, constant process. It's not something. Um, it is something that does respond to any and all movements, but it doesn't have to wait till some threshold of, you know, oh, there's actually a revolutionary movement in the U.S. that needs to be crushed right now. It just constantly is this mode of operations. So insurgency, um, a basic understanding of insurgency within counterinsurgency literature is that there's a group of people who have current and historical grievances who are willing to possibly go beyond legal means in order to move their cause forward. That's it. Very simple. It's a really low bar. And actually, you can see this more clearly when you watch right-wing media, right? Because they're, like, really adept at naming and vilifying things that they see as potentially insurgent through this kind of understanding of things on a constant basis, right? Um, the people that they go after, right? They go after radicals in education. They'll always name, liberal media will be like, they kind of want to add more nuance to it and not name what they feel about movements and things like that. But they'll say like, oh yeah, you know, BLM hates America, like those kind of things. Um, and I say that to say, like, whatever people think about different movements, protests, organizations, like when you watch right-wing media, it's clear that they see these things as insurgent, whether we do or not. So this is that again, that gets to the constant level and constant processes that are underway. So again, like any movement that says grievances will not, and cannot be addressed by the current order of society, and therefore we need structural change, new institutions, new social relations, reparations for Black people from slavery, land back for Indigenous people, an end to military industrial complex, US imperialism, an end to the prison industrial complex, a real climate change policy that would actually have the capability of stopping the ravages of capitalism upon our climate, right? None of those things could be addressed within our system. You know, I'll debate that with anyone. Um, and so anything in that vein is viewed as insurgent because all that insurgency means for counterinsurgency literature is that there are they'll say this too, they're valid grievances that are that the state is not capable of addressing at this time, right? And so there's a huge basis for insurgency within the United States, but very rarely do we reach that threshold where it really becomes something that would constitute a significant threat, but it's enough of a threat that they're constantly trying to counterinsurge against it, right? Um, that part around systemic, change and things that can't be changed within the system. Again, this is something that the right articulates and is more concerned with than like liberal media because and this is why they go after anything that uses terms like social justice. Like if anybody's paying attention to universities right now, there's like this assault that's going on what they call special courses that teach about things beyond the basic um, curriculum, the basic kind of prerequisites 101, 102, etc. Right. And the reason for this is that these are the classes often where people are learning about things like histories of racism, right? And so on. So all of that is under attack right now. And that's the right's fascination, again, as I said, with like diversity, equity, inclusion, critical race theory, anti-racism, and so on. And um, it's interesting now that the universities seem to me to very quickly be totally capitulating on that right-wing agenda. Maybe not everywhere, but certainly at certain universities. And the thing that has pushed it to the edge really is Palestine, right? Because I think Palestine is not it can't be co-opted through those means, right? Um, yeah. It's too structurally tied to the current operation of those universities, of those states, right? There's too much complicity, not just in the genocide, right, but in the need for this Zionist entity to have this much structural power within the Middle East, to be this garrison state, right? This strong military outpost, this outpost that has helped anti-communist movements, fascist movements around around the country, right? All of these things. Sorry, around the world. Um, but also just the strategic location of it, right? And that's always been a thing, It's I think Fred Moten in that conversation we had back in November, said about the state of Israel, it's like a dam against the motion of history. So back to elections for a second here. And I think I have kind of one more section here, and then I will open it up. And I'm um, happy to answer questions that people have. Maybe put a queue by them, even if you pushed them earlier. Put a queue by them and repost them so I can hopefully catch them at the end. Um, hang a sec. So the literature of counterinsurgency is fascinated with elections, especially among what I call the hearts and minds cohort, which is the dominant, has been the dominant. I don't know how much longer it'll be the dominant. We could discuss about whether Palestine represents a significant shift and whether this or even whether they've actually ever adhered to this hearts and mind approach, right? But they've attempted certain things, right? And so people can think about this. It's dominant because I say that because it is the official policy. It is the current counterinsurgency field manual is a hearts and minds based kind of document. And people saw this in the Iraq and Afghanistan war, which that manual really comes out of. In the language that was used by the Bush administration, by Obama subsequently to that, right, of bringing democracy. We're bringing democracy, right? That's we're liberating people, right? We bring democracy to these authoritarian countries, right? I'm being very sarcastic right now. Please don't take that seriously. But that's what they said, right? And so you could think about George Bush in that vein. You could think about Hillary Clinton. You could think about this idea of expanding women's rights in these countries that you've gone to overthrow their governments. Doing this in Afghanistan, like electing the first women to public office in these countries, right? And like this appeals, right? It seems in the brain of, I mean, on a lot of levels, right? We could say like we're against patriarchy, right? So on many levels, like this even is able to capture footholds within the left. Um, and yeah, that's a whole other topic, and we could get into that more extensively at another time, some of the problematic elements of that. But when you dig a little bit deeper, like what you really see is what they mean by democracy is elections, right? They don't mean being really responsive to what the populace wants. They don't mean addressing all of the historical grievances of a society. They certainly don't mean some kind of socialistic or communistic thing. They're directly antagonistic to that, right? What they mean, and the second part of what they mean is like they mean that this country will be a loyal client of U.S. imperialism. And again, this is something that they don't use the term imperialism, but they're very clear on this. Actually, I think I could pull up one other thing I was reading that actually made me laugh out loud the other day. Um, the so there's this book by Jacqueline Hazelton called Bullets, Not Ballots, and this person is on the fascistic side. She's arguing that we actually need that counterinsurgency should be engaged in war crimes to be successful, right? Not in trying to co-opt and win hearts and minds. And I'll show some quotes from that maybe towards the end. But it's interesting because it's much closer to what we see going on in Palestine right now. Would be the Hazelton, her approach in bullets, not ballots. Um, the but she says even in a sense in this, she says counterinsurgency is a form of great liberal power military intervention, right? So rather than saying, it's a form of US imperialism, it's a form of great liberal power military intervention, right? These great liberal powers, right? So anyways, um I mean, this is something that should be said too, is there's a completely uninterrogated support within counterinsurgency literature for US imperialism. It forms a very foundational basis of it, right? It's not, you are not able to, within that literature, to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't do imperialism. The literature is all about how to do imperialism. So again, I said this earlier, I'll just reiterate it quickly, but a there's a lot of literature, including bullets, not ballots, which you probably can gather by the name, but they would argue that elections don't work. There's also a book called Pathological Counterinsurgency, which again is about why elections don't work, right? And so there is this other body of counterinsurgency literature that says that elections don't work, right? But they are responding to the dominant premises, which are that this is what should be done. Um, and is at least within bullets, not ballots, their argument is you kill everybody that you need to kill, right? Like that's their argument, including civilians. All right, I'm gonna skip ahead of this. I mean, you could, in terms of thinking about different counterinsurgency approaches, one comparison that we have that we might be able to draw on is the difference between the Palestinian Authority, which represents more of a hearts and minds counterinsurgency approach, right? The Palestinian Authority is trained and you know supported by Israel so long as it you know accepts the legitimacy of Israel, as works with it, sees it as a partner, etc. It's also trained by U.S. counterinsurgents, right? Um, and is armed by them, right? But the arms are for controlling their own population. So that's hearts and minds, to some extent. And then the flip side would be this bullets not ballots would be how we currently see this genocidal war in Gaza, right? This is the other argument. Um, I'll actually pull that up just for a second, just so folks can see a little bit of how that's articulated within the literature. Um, all right. Let's see, can I close this? All right, so this is the first chapter, eating soup with a chainsaw. Um, so what explains success in counterinsurgency? I argue that government success against an insurgency is a nonviolent and violent competition among elites that leads to political stability. After a single armed actor, the counterinsurgent government gains dominance over the others within its territory. Um, so I'm going to read this next part, right? So here she's responding to the counterinsurgency field manual. She says, "I define success according to the U.S. government counterinsurgency guide as the quote marginalization of insurgents to the point at which they are destroyed, co-opted, or reduced to irrelevance in numbers and capability. The guide is intended for the United States." But this definition is reasonable for democratic great powers generally because it recognizes that a small number of insurgents may remain active while unlikely to seriously threaten the counterinsurgent government. The core of this definition is that the counterinsurgent government remains in power. So, this is her argument. What succeeds in counterinsurgency is uglier, costlier in lives, and more remote from moral and ethical considerations, and far less ambitious than what the United States and its partners are attempting to try to build and reform the political systems in so-called weak states and ungoverned spaces today. Both the accommodation and the violence are necessary for success. Neither is sufficient. The use of compellence, the use or threat of force to change an actor's behavior, and brute force, the power to take and to hold together, break the challenger's ability to and will to fight. Successful counterinsurgency is not, contra to the conventional wisdom, a process of building centralized, modern, liberal democratic state, providing political, economic, and social reforms intended to support such an effort, and providing public goods to the people to gain their support for the government. It is not a competition to govern with the people as its prize. Counterinsurgency is competition for power among armed groups. Successful counterinsurgency is one armed group coming to dominate the rest. Um, let's see. So then this is one other part I wanted to read because again, this relates to Gaza. So she talks about compellence theory, right, and talks about the need to recruit political elites, right, as one of the keys, right, because the elites can fund the insurgency is the argument. Um, the other aspect is that compellence theory identifies the government's use of force against civilians as well as the insurgents as an important factor in counterinsurgency success rather than a choice likely to damage or doom the government's chance of success, right? So here she's arguing you also kill civilians, right? And that is how you succeed. Um, Again, this is in requirements. A second requirement is the application of brute force to reduce the flow of resources to the insurgency, often but not always, and certainly not only by controlling civilian behavior with brute force. The third requirement is the direct application of force to break the insurgency's will and compel and capability to fight on, right? So I just wanted to show that because, even in discussions with counterinsurgency that we've had so far, often we've talked about the hearts and minds approach and sort of suggested that what's going on in Gaza, and I think I'm guilty of this as well, is beyond counterinsurgency, right? It's genocide, and I think it is genocide. But what I'm saying now is that, and you can actually see this within the field manual as well. But they're comfortable with genocide, and they actually advocate. I mean, what's being advocated for there are war crimes, right? Like they're not allowed to just kill civilians in, international law, right? Um, and so, anyways, there's a U.S. policy that not policy, but U.S. counterinsurgent theory that aligns with what the Zionist entity is doing currently. So I apologize, that got us off track a little bit, but I did want to cover that. So back to elections again. So we're leaving that school of thought and going back to the hearts and minds, going back to the part of counterinsurgency literature that Jacqueline, what's her name? Jacqueline Hazelton, that she's critiquing. So they see the elections as this way to gain legitimacy. Why do they think that? Right. So it offers a peaceful means of bringing your concerns forward and playing a role in the future of your state. Right. I'll pull up quickly the generational approach. So this is actually just to pull up a little bit within the counterinsurgency field manual, which is the official U.S. policy. So a generational approach, and I did a little bit, I think we did a live on the generational approach, so you folks can check that out. But it includes activities that interact with segments of the population and seek to influence the home nation, that's the counterinsurgent government, let's just call it that, to educate and empower relevant populations within their government to participate in legal methods of political discourse and dissent. They, it's a response to the common goal of many insurgent groups to attract youth to its ranks. A generational approach provides alternatives for youth. Don't join a party, don't join an organization. Come and participate in our democratic processes. It empowers youth to protest in nonviolent manners and participate in the development and decision making in their communities. This robs the insurgency of a disillusioned population from which to recruit. It is assumed most insurgencies last for years, then it becomes important not only to influence the present day leaders, but also for the home nation to form and mold the next generation of leaders to become peaceful participants in the existing form of government. A note of caution associated with generational engagement. The population or youth groups may demonstrate and protest the very government the counterinsurgent hoped they would support. However, this might not be a failure, but rather a success. As is expected in functional societies, mass mobilizations and protests are preferred reactions to government failures instead of violent resistance or coup attempts. To ensure youth don't become future insurgent fighters, it is important to create channels for youth leaders to interact with their elders and power brokers in their own communities. Many insurgencies are generational affairs for families, and children are taught at a young age to fight for the insurgency cause. A generational approach seeks to influence segments of a population to understand the benefit of participating in peaceful means to address their core grievances, getting used to understand the legal means they have to address root causes of conflict is a critical tool for reducing violence. It If commanders and staff believe insurgencies may occur over extended periods, then some efforts should be made to interact with the next generation of leaders who can establish a lasting peace. Interaction with intellectual elites of the country should also be a consideration. Lastly, I'll just read this little segment. Commanders planning to use a generational approach should identify relevant target audiences within the population. Plans and methods for conducting discourse may vary depending on the operating environment and the culture. The use this this method is used in conjunction with direct methods, right? Direct counterinsurgency, warfare, policing, etc., as part of a comprehensive approach to combating insurgent forces. Counterinsurgents can make progress in defeating counterinsurgent forces, but if they neglect the younger generation of the population, they may lose the war. On a more, you know, difficult to wrap our brains around because it's so awful, note related to that part about worrying about use and future insurgency, you can think about how obsessed the Zionist entity is with killing Palestinian children, right? Um, so again, that's the brute force, right, or the compellence theory, of, form of counterinsurgency. The hearts and minds is get them invested in the democratic process, right? These young people who have been protesting, who have been in encampments, who have been a part of the student intifada, who are getting more and more militant, right? Joe Biden was not capable of counterinsurging against that population. You couldn't convince people that Genocide Joe was going to be somebody that could, address that he cared. Nobody believes that he was going to do anything to stop what's going on in Palestine, that he was going to do anything to, stop arms shipments. Like, there's no reason to believe that. And you couldn't convince anybody of that. I don't think any Palestinians are going to be fooled. I don't think they'll be fooled by Kamala Harris, you know, but I do worry about, I hate the term allies, but allies, right? I do worry about people who have supported the Palestinian cause, who have been a part of these things now saying, hey, maybe Kamala Harris. Um, I will say, I'm going to pull up something else, like just quickly. See, do I have it here? Yeah. So immediately after the announcement, another thing that you saw, and I'm always wary when the media does this because media is a full partner in counterinsurgency. The Atlantic talks about what a great manual it is. They participate in the process of developing the counterinsurgency field manual. They like the hearts and minds approach, especially the liberal media. So, this is the articles that start to come out as soon as Kamala Harris is named as the candidate, right? And so all of these articles within, you know, a 24-hour period basically about maybe she'll be better on Palestine. The Intercept, which Jeremy Scahill recently left, which Glenn Greenwald left a while ago. Not that I think he's a political compass in any way, but you know, sometimes people on the left look to the Intercept. They do have money for reporting and stuff. But their first article, the subheader is Kamala Harris is less burdened by Biden's disastrous support for Israelis' war, sparking some hope in pro-Palestine advocates. Right? Counterinsurgency in the media, even in the left media, right? What do I mean by that? I mean, I think that, look, people should do whatever they can to try to change the administration's policy. I'm not against people taking any means to that, but I think all of these articles are designed again to suggest that the person who's been vice president, amid the genocide, who has not critiqued, U.S. policy, who has been to AIPAC and talked about her support of Israel and so on, right? That she is going to represent some significant policy break. I think that is wholly misguided. But I think that's what they want, right? That's what they want us to believe, is that she represents some kind of break here and that there's an opening, right? And then she'll try to, I think, she's not going to Netanyahu's speech. She's meeting with him privately instead. So there's going to be a process where I think, and it's difficult because obviously she's got to try to court Zionists as well. But she's going to try to walk some kind of tightrope of not being seen as being directly complicit and maybe seeing a little more critical of what's going on than Joe Biden has been. And you saw Joe at different points trying to do this, right? Trying to distance himself from Netanyahu and so on, right? And it just didn't work, right? Because you're doing it, you're saying this, and you're sending him more weapons, right? So now you have a situation where Joe Biden can continue to do that. He can continue to send more weapons. Congress, government, everybody can send more weapons to Israel, right? And Kamala can kind of stay out of that and bring people in, right? And so again, think about those things that were said in the counterinsurgency field manual. You're looking for groups, for populations that you can peel off and get interested in what you're doing, right? So it's all about um, it's all about these populations. I don't even want to use the term insurgent populations because it's it's disaffected populations. It's populations that don't see the legitimacy of a current, ruler. Unfortunately, I think one of the big problem within the US is that we very strongly attribute things to the president of the United States, right? That he sets the policy, that he leads whatever we're doing in foreign countries and so on. And look, I think that's wrong. Like, I think that it's about imperialism, right? It's about capitalism. These are systems. There's a tremendous amount of money that's tied up in these things. There are extremely powerful forces behind them, right? And that's not in like a conspiratorial manner, although they do act conspiratorially. But like Boeing, Raytheon, all of this, right? There's just a huge investment among the ruling class in certain policies, and one of them is the settler colonial outpost of the Zionist entity, right? And so Donald Trump is on board with that. I want to be clear about that. Kamala Harris is on board with that, right? So to me, the interest is like, what are those of us that are disaffected from that whole system? Like, what are we doing? And, you know, Two Black the other day, I said, do we really want to have this argument every 4 years with people who are like dyed in the wool Democrats, like get out the vote? And, I agree with them. I mean, I don't, I look at it as a failure and I'm self-critical around it as much as anyone else. Um, that we don't have that I don't feel like we have enough strong organizations that present real alternatives for people. And the ones that we do have, I'm appreciative of, right? And I encourage people to join organizations, to struggle, to fight for something better. But yeah. So I'll say that, right? Just leave that there for now. Um, So, anyways, one a last kind of a last section. So, why do counterinsurgents be so obsessed with viewing elections as such an important step in establishing counterinsurgency? Um, so, this is something like again, there's debates within the literature, but nonetheless, there's a significant school of people who are like, yeah, elections. That's what we need. That's why they were so quick to do elections in Iraq, so quick to try to do elections in Afghanistan, right? The counter literature says, hey, look at all these times you tried to do this, it didn't work, right? But nonetheless, that dominant literature was pushing and led to these attempts. So why do they think that, right? So I think the main reason why counterinsurgents are obsessed with elections and see it as such an effective step in establishing counterinsurgency is because of its effectiveness within the West. It's because it's effective in the United States, right? So they're not interested in bringing democracy because they think it's a real expression of the people's values, desires, etc. They're interested in bringing elections because they think that elections are very effective as tools of counterinsurgency, right? Like even in that piece, it's talking about, hey, dissent is good, right? We want people to be, but we want peaceful protests. We don't want insurgencies. So think about this. Think about this from the Marxist literature, right? There's always been this question, right, of why the revolutions, the communist revolutions, the socialist revolutions, the anti-colonial revolutions, why did these things happen not in Western Europe? Marx said it was going to happen in Germany, in France, in England, right? Um, and there's a whole body of communist thought, of socialist thought that says, look, it's because the chains of capitalism are stronger, right? In those countries, it's easier for them to suppress um, the weaker links, right? The revolutions happen at the weakest links in the chain, right? I think Lenin, argued this. Um, that's one way to look at it. The counterinsurgents look at it differently. They say, I I read them as saying, no, like the reason why you don't have revolutions in United States and Canada and Australia and the UK, Western Europe, New Zealand, right, is because of their electoral processes. Um, you know, Russia, Yugoslavia, China, Vietnam, Korea, Cuba, Angola, Mozambique. These are countries where you had that socialist, that communist current, like leading to revolutionary change, right? They weren't. I try to think of all of them, but I don't think in any of them were they currently under a regime that was trying to co-opt them through elections, right? So this is, I think, how they think about it, right? It's a whole other topic of discussion. It would be interesting to get into and to talk about with people that are study revolution, all of that. But it's an interesting proposal from counterinsurgents, I think, because certainly we can see how effective elections are in the United States at channeling whatever movements, whatever dissent, into usually the Democratic Party on the left, right? Shout out to Glenn Ford, rest in power. Um, Other reasons, so elections allow for what's called the peaceful transition of power, right? This is something that we always tout, right? It's why certain people got really mad at Trump because he didn't want to allow the peaceful transition of power, right? Um, and the United States wants that in other countries because if there's elections also just from a more capitalist imperialist perspective, right? You can buy elections. You can invest in the media there, you can invest in candidates and parties there, you can funnel it through local elites, right? And so, Venezuela would be a great example of this right now, right? Whatever people think about Maduro, like currently he's up for election again, and there's a US backed candidate that has the largest potential at winning the election against him. Um, we could talk about Bolivia and other examples, but you know, of Bolivia, they don't, Mas wins the elections. But there's this is the problem, right? This is one of the fundamental problems that the United States has. Obviously, we don't, as a country, not we, but the United States doesn't like the politics of China, of Cuba, of the DPRK, right? Of Venezuela, et cetera. But of those first three, if we think about China, Cuba, and the DPRK, one of the big frustrations for the United States is that they can't penetrate the elections, right? To be able to offer in their, to try to sell people on, you know, a US led capitalist policy, right? Of we need to be partners and open up our markets and yada yada yada. So they like it because it's an avenue, right? It's a lever of control that they can use down the line. Um, Another thing is that it's a process of re-legitimation. It's a process of it's a ritual, right? We have elections every year in the United States. Like, they could set the elections and sync them all up and say, "Hey, every 4 years, we're gonna elect all of these different offices and do it one time, and we're gonna take a month doing it, and it's gonna be a really protagonistic process where everybody participates." And there's a lot of there's be a ton of ways to further democratize our process if they wanted to, but they don't wanna do that, right? So they wanna make it this very, opaque, difficult. People move up the ranks of these different systems, right? And there's only a very small people that you could even have the potential, right, of actually running or being voted for, right? And so um, all of that, but there's this theater around it. There's this way that we get reinvested in it. Um, and re-legitimizing the state, I mean, I don't mean the state in an abstract sense. It's a whole other debate of whether people, I don't want to get into the anti-state pro-state debate on here today. um, but what I mean by that is it re-legitimizes the United States. It re-legitimizes, which is an empire, which is an imperialist power, right? And so it is a way of drawing people into that orbit, figuring out, like, saying, I mean, the very idea that people should say, "Oh, well, let's not worry too much about the genocide. We can't do much about that. Let's focus on domestic policy." Right? I mean, only an imperial country is that conversation, you know well, I shouldn't say that. I mean, there's other countries where they debate around foreign policy, but, like, the notion that yeah, I mean, that's an imperialist perspective. So when we see that floated out, right? That's what that is. It's a counterinsurgency. It's an imperialist viewpoint. Now, this gets into kind of the last thing maybe that I'll say, and then we could just kind of open it up. Is that well, a couple other things before I do that. So I know I've said the last thing like 10 times. So we bring our issues to them, right? And that's part of it. This is counterinsurgency 101, is rather than taking our issues, building a radical or revolutionary organization, building a mass base around it, engaging in combative, protagonistic culture around the things that we want and we need, maybe participating in elections alongside other non-parliamentary tactics, as was said in that section I showed of "That's a Fear of the Ruling Class" too. Um, right, that we just look to the Democratic Party as the way to resolve the things that we're concerned about, right? And they'll have certain issues that they'll try to pull out that they think that they can get our investment around. They don't resolve them, right? And this again gets to that point in Ungovernable Society where he's talking about, the ruling class realized at a certain point, hey, like, how about neither of the parties engaged in resolving the issue, right? And we just go back and forth, and people will just get more and more disaffected with both of them. And then we may have a crisis of legitimacy down the road, right? And so that's again the point, is like Biden and Trump, from their concern, was a crisis of legitimacy. I think that's what they saw. The other last thing on that set of points is that you know elections offer this opportunity to develop leadership from within oppressed communities. Again, going back to that part I showed in the counterinsurgency field manual on the generational approach, this is where you get neocolonialism, right? It's where you get what Glenn Ford would call the Black misleadership class, right? I think it fell, but I had up behind me at one point Tu Black and Rasul Moat's book Laundering Black Rage. And again, I think that's a good book thinking about counterinsurgency coming out of colonialism and thinking about these as like prolonged processes, not just um, the momentary co-optation, right? But it's just it's a very long kind of generational approach that is taken to counterinsurgency. Um, all right. I'm gonna leave it there for now. There's some other notes. The other thing I wanted to say is that social media crowdsources the counterinsurgency, and this is the frustrating part for a lot of us, right? Is that we get on these apps and we get really frustrated because you know, we see random people, and some of them are paid by the Democratic Party or the state or the elites, right, to be counterinsurgents. Um, we see yeah, you see all kinds of crazy things that people say, right? And so that's the point where we're at. Some people are paid to do that, right? Some people just do it because it's just what they believe, right? Have um they have bought into the idea of political liberalism and the way that they're told that our institutions work, right? And so like I also say this is like some of those people are doing it. I don't even want to ascribe some form of malevolence, right? It's a miseducation problem. It's a, you know, Orasami Burton mentioned to me that there's another part in Ungovernable Society that I didn't pull up, but it got referenced there around elections. But he said it comes from schools too, and Shamayu names it in there as well. But like that part of what education is to increase the frustration tolerance of the population, right? So we teach kids to be used to doing stuff that's really annoying, frustrating, and boring, right? So they get prepared that that's what our system is, right? And they develop a tolerance to that. And again, like there's a high frustration tolerance that's built into these elections, right? You're taught to treat the process as um that yeah, it might be this is a great example of this Obama, right? He used to do the thing where he'd say, hey, it's kind of the unfortunately the Dr. King quote, works here where he talks about the long arc of history, or I'm going to mess it up, but basically the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice, right? The moral arc of the universe, I think that's what it is. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, something along those lines, right? And that's kind of Obama kind of took that and say, hey, we move forward, we make some progress. It's not everything. You idealists, you young people with your crazy ideas, like it doesn't work like that, right? Like so, again, like building in these an attempt always to lower our expectations of what our society can be, right? And to teach that's a psychological warfare. That's what that is, right? Um, all right. All right. I'm looking to see if there were any questions in the chat. Um, yeah, I saw that. Shout out to Eric Stanley. Yeah, I mean, this is like I've heard people talk about rather than the Overton window that people sometimes describe, the ratchet effect. Um, a friend of mine, Dan, talks about that sometimes, right? Which is like it doesn't the system doesn't actually move back to the left. It goes to the right, and then the way a ratchet works, right? It clicks into place and it won't go back to the left, but it'll go further to the right, right? So I think that's good. Um, and you could see that in terms of that Shamayu piece as well there, right? Because what he's talking about is the ruling class saying, hey, we need to stop addressing people's concerns, right? And this is interesting within the counterinsurgency literature because that's part of one of the debates too, is that there's this argument about whether addressing people's concerns actually builds legitimacy for the state, and that's part of why the more fascistic side of it is like, no, you just got to kill the people who believe in the insurgency or who support it, even if they're civilians. Like, it doesn't matter. Um, so why did Scahill leave? I think he put out some kind of statement on it. He has a new thing, Drop Site News, which is operating currently on what's that platform where you can just self-publish that a lot of, it's not Medium, but the one where you can do subscriptions. I'm blanking. Somebody will tell me in the chat. But he has been doing more talks on Democracy Now, but he's not on Democracy Now. He's gone to created his own independent thing, basically. Yes, I think that's true. Glenn Greenwald did leave because they were too left. All right. Thanks everybody for coming through. I don't see any other questions. Dr. Green's views. But if you have them, go ahead and repost them at the bottom, because I'm trying to. I can get, if anybody wants to read this, I can find them a link to it. It's not good. I should say this: all of these counterinsurgency books are terrible. They're just awful. It's painful to read. I'm and I should say along those lines, like, I'm interested in kind of working with folks who want to develop a kind of critical counterinsurgency studies forum, right? Because I think that the stuff is so bad, and it needs us to critically engage with it. All right, let's see. What's the definition? I still don't really understand the language chosen the highest stage. Is it the fact that elections can be tracked with metrics, polling, and such a component, it seems viable? So this is a good question. So again, we could debate about whether it's the highest stage. I would say it is a key aspiration. I thought it was a good, snappy title. Some of the counterinsurgents definitely see it as this really key piece. I think maybe arguing it's the highest stage, right, would be along the lines of looking at something that's more implicit than explicit in most of what I've read. But it's that, again, like, this whole language of like Western great democratic powers bringing, doing counterinsurgency, right? The idea is that the West has something figured out that it needs to impose. It's very much part of the colonizing, civilizing mission in the 21st century iteration of it, right? 21st century iteration of it, right? It's this idea that elections create this like really great institution through which to effectively fight insurgencies. And actually, what's interesting is that there's a lot of solid critique of this within counterinsurgency literature. The scary thing about that critique is that it's, again, based in this notion of like, no, we should do fascism instead. It's not based on this idea of, imperialism is wrong and it doesn't work. And the reason that elections don't work is that um, the the country that you are engaging in imperialism against, that the people see that as an illegitimate process, that they see that as an imposition, right? And so they fight against it, right? Which that would be my argument. My argument would be the reason why bringing elections to Iraq or Afghanistan or trying to do them in Yemen or Palestine doesn't produce the outcome that the counterinsurgents want is because the population can see that it's counterinsurgency, right? They can see that this is being imposed, that it's not coming organically from their own people, right? So it's a basic fundamental denial of their sovereignty, right? That's much harder to make that argument in the West because we've had them for so long and we've been ingrained for so long that this is the way that we do politics, right? So That's my theory around why it's more effective in the West, although it's interesting to go back. I would love to do something where maybe we dig into, like, you know, early attempts at elections within the West and, how that worked, and yeah, it's another thread to go down, but that's, I think, why they're so obsessed with it, is because it's actually just reflective of their own, uh, beliefs in the supremacy of their own political system as the correct one. But what's interesting about it is that they see it in counterinsurgency literature, again, not as, um they don't approach it in, "Hey, we need to bring democracy to these countries." That's what they need. They need to be able to express their political will and form the society that they want. Um, might be another part I could pull up here on this. Yeah. This is again from Bullets, Not Ballots. Um, it is unlikely that the future will bring successful efforts to use good governance to succeed in counterinsurgency. Governments willing and able to make good governance reforms do so. Those that resist reforms continue to resist for logical reasons, making governance more equitable and just, serving popular interests, institutionalizing and bureaucratizing the state, instituting free and fair elections, liberalizing the media, instituting rule of law. These are all reforms that directly or indirectly reduce the power and wealth of the governed aligned elites. Corrupt, repressive governments persist because corruption and repression serves the interest of those in power. What is it that I think it was Rafat that used to say that everything is a confession, right? Everything that they say about Palestinians is a confession. That's a confession, right? That's like, hey, the reason that our governments don't actually, because this is the thing, there's a weird part in counterinsurgency literature where they give the idea that by bringing elections and bringing these democratic processes, that it allows the people to have the kind of state that they want, that it allows it to reform in certain ways. Now, it also says that the home nation must subsume itself to US imperial interests. It says that, right? It doesn't use imperial, but it says that. Um, So again, those things are fundamentally at odds, and the United States is not, they're in their counterinsurgency literature, they're not capable of wrestling with that contradiction. They're not capable of wrestling with that the sovereignty of other countries is actually at odds, and their ability to define their own political future is at odds with saying the government actually has to do whatever the United States wants it to do. Right. Um, so is it actually the highest stage? Yeah, I don't know. Meh, leave it there. Um, maybe you could say more about this, Jared, if you're still on. And I realize this was something I was talking about much earlier. Um, but yes, I think this might be an argument that the elections, among other things, right, among the media work, among all these other attempts, right, that this is why we aren't there yet. The constant counterinsurgent work, right? So the highest stage, this is kind of an argument that, like, yeah, that Western, maybe the United States or Western society represents the highest stage of counterinsurgency, and that the elections and funneling politics through the elections is a key part of that counterinsurgency process. Cornell West said Harris has received 5.5 million from APAC. I'm sure that's true. Charibu, appreciate you. I yeah, I I don't know what Obama is doing with that. I imagine that he will now that Harris has um, secured the delegates that she needs, right? Um, so I don't think that I think maybe he was just trying to play coy, maybe make it look less like he was really involved in getting Joe to step down. Um, that would be more my guess, but it's just speculation. All right. Yeah, absolutely. I hope that Lauren Shihai and I can talk about that. It's interesting. I mean, Lara Shihai is really starting to get more into counterinsurgency, in part because of conversations we've had here and because of Dylan Rodriguez and others. She hasn't yet studied it a lot in terms of um, the actual literature, but um, but she brings all of that knowledge around psychological warfare, right? Around psyops and um, around the ways that so that's a key aspect of counterinsurgency, and they say that within their own literature. They're like, "Hey, we do psychological operations, like we do propaganda." They say this. Um, all right. We need counterinsurgency handbook. So one thing I will say, and I meant to say this up front, and it's part of why I put some of the books behind me that I did, even though a couple of them fell down. But I do actually think maybe we need some of this. Um, but counterinsurgency is filled with certain, like I said, liberal presuppositions, right? It believes that political liberalism is the highest stage of political the highest political stage, right? Like it's better than any other system. Um, it it believes that imperialism again is a fundamental, like taken for granted thing within this literature, uninterrogated totally. So yeah, the counterinsurgency could point all those out, and I do. Yeah, I like the idea. I've talked about, like I said, critical counterinsurgency studies and so on. But I do think that reading real literature from revolutionaries is actually more valuable a lot of the time because they now we have to analyze our present, right? So that's a whole different thing. Um, but you can see the ways that people have grappled with these processes, how trying to counter these tactics, trying to develop strategies and tactics of their own um, through past revolutions. And I think those are a lot of the most meaningful stuff and more meaningful than me or anybody else just picking apart the stuff. I see this as maybe some small contribution, right, that we can make is to because I think a lot of people are not aware or they don't want to accept that their government is constant. Their government, it's not just their government, the government, the state, the media, the ruling class, that they're constantly at war with them, right? That there's a class war, that there's a racialized class war, right? And that this is a constant process that all of these forces are engaged in. And that's something that we could call counterinsurgency in the United States context, right? Because we are capitalist imperialist nation. There's another interesting aspect of this, which is like within counterinsurgency literature, there is some stuff dealing with communist counterinsurgency, right? So talking about how effective the USSR was at counterinsurgency, talking about how effective Cuba is at counterinsurgency, right? So these are interesting things too. But it's really a difficult literature for us to um, engage on its own premises because it's just it 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 operates on this very kind of basic premise, which is there's insurgencies and then there's a state that's trying to suppress the insurgencies, right? And like there's no interest in engaging with the validity of people to resist oppression, colonialism, imperialism, right? And to define their own political future. So it's yeah, I'd just say that. It's not always the most helpful. Jared, I would love to have some more conversations with you on that. Substack. Yes. So this is what thanks everybody. Everybody replied to this and I'm just now getting to it. But that's what Scahill's drop site news is operating out of. Um Sorry, I'm just going through to see if I missed anything. Thanks everybody. I appreciate you. Um all right. Monica, appreciate your support very much. Thank you. Librarian, thank you. ACAB. Um, Monica, so yes, there will be multiple parts, right? I said a little bit about this up front. I'm for sure want to have one with Dylan Rodriguez. He and I have talked about possibly like a DNC watch party, which I don't even know if I can handle that level of psychological warfare, but maybe it would be fun with friends. But certainly we'll do something with Laura Shihai, again, Jared Ball, like, hopefully Orasami Burton, Brooke Terpstra, maybe Wendy Trevino. There's a lot of people that I would like to talk to about this from different vantages and perspectives, including like a lot of stuff on the local level. Like we're talking about this in national elections, and I think that's one thing. Um, and and you know, sometimes it's most painful on the local level, you know? And so there's a lot of good stuff we could engage there, so I hope to do that too. Um, hey, if Jared, if you wanna join us for the DNC watch party, we could do it. Maybe we could do it as a combined thing or something. Um, Here's a question. Thank you. Books on a general note. Whew, um A lot. By the way, one of the books I wanted to put behind me that I just couldn't find today is Tip of the Spear by Orasami Burton, because again, another book that I would put into a category of, um, it's a study of sort of revolution, counter-revolution, but it's Ori is one of those people that I think takes counterinsurgency and the things that these counterinsurgents or counter-revolutionaries, as he calls them correctly, very seriously in his work. And he's somebody I talk to about this stuff. But that book is a great example of, an alternative, I think, to kind of just engaging these people on their own terms and trying to debunk. So Tip of the Spear would be one book that I recommend. We're gonna do a study group. It's starting up on you can find it on our Patreon. Um, and we're going to do Trinity of Fundamentals, which is another book that I'm really excited to read with folks. So those are a couple, but there's so many books. I mean, if you just look through the history of our YouTube channel, but even more through the history of our podcast, which you can find on Spotify or iTunes or any of these other evil platforms. Um, there's a lot of books that Josh, my co-host, co-founder of this with me, and I have read and discussed over the years. So yeah, there's too many for me to recommend right now, but if you are interested in reading suggestions, there's a lot of stuff you can kind of go through in terms of conversations we've had about books to see if there's ones in there that you're interested in reading. Um, I will not be making it a drinking game, but people are welcome to do that. But yeah, that wouldn't go well for me. Um, all right. I'm gonna leave it there. I appreciate you all for hanging out with me for the last couple of hours. There will be more. We'll also, as I said, get more into specifically like what makes Kamala Harris an effective counterinsurgent or a more effective counterinsurgent than Joe Biden, right? Especially in this moment. I think that's a fertile area for some good discussion. Yeah, didn't get to that today, but I think that there's a lot to that. And yeah, appreciate you all, appreciate folks for coming through, people who supported, people who support us in a variety of ways. And I will last thing say that I believe on Sunday we'll be live again with Abdul Jawad Omar, and I'm very much looking forward to that. So um you know yeah, anyway, all right.